Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on preparing your pitch. This webinar will be presented by Foresight Senior Consultant, Mr. Ed Kase. Throughout his career and for more than 20 years, Ed has been focused on strategic marketing and business development, helping companies understand market conditions and implement go-to-market strategies. Ed received his MBA from Colorado State University and also holds a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Clarkson University. Now, before we get started, I'd like to point out that your microphones will be muted throughout the duration of this presentation. So if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box and we'll be sure to answer them at the end of this Q&A session. Okay, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you, Ed.
Thanks, Alyssa. Well, good morning to everyone. Happy to be here this morning. So we're going to talk a little bit about preparing an investor pitch, and it's kind of interesting because I get on both sides of this. I help people prepare pitches, and I do some judging for a couple of the entities out here in Colorado. So I've kind of seen it from both sides. As we think about doing an investor pitch, I think it's really important to realize that, are people seeing slides advance? I'm not. That's better. So the thing that's important to remember is that you're telling your story, and the goal of giving a pitch is not necessarily that someone's going to write you a check right at the end of your pitch. It's that you want to get a next meeting. So it's real important to tell the story that you're passionate about. So we're going to go through the elements of a pitch, but if they don't fit your business or you're not comfortable with them, you should adapt the outline rather than force yourself into the outline, because when I've seen people force themselves into an outline, it doesn't necessarily end well. So in a lot of the content that I'm taking, you'll see a note at the bottom of the slide. There's a gentleman by the name of Dave McClure, and there's a link to his website on the last slide that provides a lot of guidance about how to do a pitch. So those resources are available to you, and that's largely where I've taken a lot of this content from. Some best practices. So the first one is, I think we've all experienced the death by PowerPoint experience, and you really don't want to do that. You want to be brief, use your slides to highlight themes, and you want to talk about the slides as opposed to reading them. So those are some of the best practices to keep in mind. Because it's a pitch and you're looking for something at the end, be clear about what you're asking for. And a real common thing that happens, and I've seen this in a number of the competitions that I judge, is that when technologists talk too much about their technology, they lose the audience. You have to talk about the problems you solve in terms that people in general can understand. So those are some things to keep in mind as you are preparing your pitch and kind of putting your speaker's notes in, that you want to tell a clean story and not read your slides, and not try to use a lot of visuals as opposed to text-heavy slides. And I apologize, because this is an instructional presentation, I've got a lot of text-heavy slides. So don't do what you're seeing necessarily being presented here. This is kind of an outline of what a pitch should look like. And it's kind of in this order, and these are the ones you want to really highlight. A lot of times pitch competitions are timed, so you may or may not be able to get all these slides in, but you should prepare all of these slides because I think the content's important and it helps you understand your business. With that said, if you're in a situation where you are in a timed pitch competition and there's just no way you can talk about 12 slides, what are the ones you have to have? So you can see highlighted to the right, that's kind of what you should be thinking that you need to have. You need to talk about the problem, the solution, the market, your technology, what traction you have in the market, and who's on your team. All the other slides, still prepare them, move them to backup slides, because sometimes if there's a Q&A period, you may get an opportunity to bring one of those slides up and refer to it. So, and I've seen time limits as short as 5 minutes. Very seldom do you see something much longer than 15 minutes. So if you go back to the original um, slide deck, being able to talk through 12 slides in 15 minutes is about as fast as you can go and still have a cadence that people can continue to follow. So the first slide is the elevator pitch. It's kind of, who you are, what you do, why you do it. You want to keep it real short. You want to avoid using a lot of industry acronyms or industry terms that aren't going to be readily available to your audience. Sometimes investors invest in your space all the time and they're comfortable with using the insider lingo. Sometimes they're not. So try to keep that to a minimum. The big thing is you want to make sure that you explain what your value is in the market, why people want your solution. So those are things to keep in mind, and try to have fun. One of the things I see a lot is people get so hung up on their timing and their cadence and everything like that that they don't connect with the audience. And it's real important that you have a connection because, again, your goal out of this is to have a follow-on discussion. So keep that in mind. You should start with the problem being solved. You want to talk about how big is the problem, um, who has the problem, what does it cost them to not solve the problem. So examples are if your technology shortens someone's workflow. So in a medical setting, it may be that, by using your technology, they're able to automate a certain part of a medical procedure. And because they can do that, that allows them to, for instance, see 2 more additional patients a day. So there's a monetary gain that is occurring because of using your technology. So try to pull things like that in. Use examples, talk about, kind of a use case or something that resonates with someone who is familiar with this particular industry or application area. So you want to make sure that people understand that there's a problem out there, and by using your technology, it either eliminates a pain or it provides a gain. So a gain could be seeing more patients. Eliminating a pain could be that maybe you have a piece of software that allows 2 systems to merge their data together. So now you've eliminated the pain of having to go to 2 systems to find medical records, or for example, or something like that. When you talk about your solution, again, talk about the problem you solve, talk about some kind of use case. Usually what it comes down to is your solution is either better, cheaper, or faster. You're typically not all 3. You may be 2, you may just be 1. But make sure that you're clear about how your solution primarily is different than the incumbent solution, because regardless of who you think your competition is, your biggest competition is always going to be the way they do it today. So make sure you hit on that so that as people are considering your solution, they can think about your technology in the terms of the way they do things today. And again, talk about what you do, not how you do it. So don't get into the technology of how you do a certain type of image processing or something like that, because that typically is going to be at a technical depth that your audience may not follow and could cause them to kind of tune out your presentation because it's not at a level they can understand. So everybody likes to see some information about your market size. And the problem is that a lot of those market size statistics are in, larger market analysis reports. And those reports can be pretty pricey. A pretty typical cost would be about $5,000 for a report. So how do you get that data? Um, a lot of times, if you look around, you might find out that um, because they want someone to buy the report, someone like Forrester or Gartner may do a press release, and they may put enough information in a press release or in a summary of the report as a teaser to get you to buy the whole report, that you can at least get some idea of how big is your market from whatever the base year is, what's it going to be, some projection into the future, what the compound annual growth is going to be, what's driving the market, who major players are in the market. Very frequently, at least a summary of that information is provided in a press release. So you can get this information freely. Other sources, sometimes through your public library. Here in the state of Colorado, I can get IDC market research, or I can get IBIS World market research. The other thing is that you may be able to get it through an industry association. I do a lot of aerospace work, and the Satellite Industry Association actually publishes market research that they've paid for. So it's freely available if you know where to look for it. Those are all great numbers to give you that top-down approach of the market's this big, but when it comes down to how much of that market do you really address, you can do something like a calculation from the bottom up. So you can figure out, what the average transaction is. So you're gonna have to talk to people, do some customer discovery, and find out what do they pay for the incumbent solution? What might they pay for one of your competitors? How many customers do you think there are in the market? Sometimes, if it's capital equipment, customer buys once every 5 years. If it's capital equipment with consumables, they may buy, again, the equipment once every 5 years, but they may buy consumables multiple times per year. It may be something that they buy on a recurring basis. If it's a software product, you may have a subscription pricing model as opposed to a paid up type model. Or even with your paid up model, you may have software maintenance and updates. So there are ways you can do some simple things that give you a revenue projection that represents a percentage of that larger market. So it's good to know how big the market is and how fast it's growing from that top-down approach. But when you start to get into things like total addressable market, sometimes it's better to also add in a bottom-up approach to sizing your market. So a business model, how do you plan to make money? And there are different tools you can go and use to do a business model formulation. A real popular one is one called the Business Model Canvas. It's from a group called strategizer.com, and strategizer is strategy, zer.com. It's actually a European organization that's put this forward, but it helps you sort out who your customers are, what your channels might be, your value proposition, helps you prioritize key activities and key resources and identify key partners. So the important thing about a business model is when you're going into a relationship where you're trying to get someone to fund you, it's very important that you've got a thought out process and that you note your assumptions, because while they may disagree with some of your assumptions, seeing that you have a business thought process makes them more comfortable to invest money with you. Dwight Eisenhower is famous for saying, plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. And kind of the thought behind that is, once you've kind of done the plan, you've kind of thought through alternatives and you've made decisions and you've made assumptions. When an assumption is proven wrong, because you've done that planning process, you can then adapt or pivot to whatever the current reality might be for a situation. So in your business model, you want to talk about how you're going to get revenue, when you're going to get to a break even or profitability, and what your revenue model is. And there's basically two revenue models. direct and indirect, and then there's variants of those. So direct, you're selling something outright. It may be a subscription. It may be some other direct relationship with a customer. And an indirect relationship is typically one where you're using a partner or a distributor or some organization in the middle of the relationship between you and the end use customer. So what investors want to know is what's your unfair advantage? How are you going to keep people, particularly your competitors, from doing exactly what you do, or challenging you on price, or somehow um, preventing you from being successful in the market? And a lot of times that unfair advantage comes in the form of a barrier to entry. So maybe you have a key patent that is very defensible. If your product requires regulatory approval, um, you can get a first mover advantage if you're the first one to get that regulatory approval. Particularly if it's a long process, if your competitors are behind you somewhere in that process, it gives you an opportunity to be working in the market without those direct competitors. And sometimes it's a qualification. As I said, I do a lot of stuff in the aerospace industry, and if you have a product that has to go onto a spacecraft, having it already been in orbit and being what they term is space qualified can be a tremendous advantage. Um, Other things that can be an advantage is that you're already a market leader, some experience that exists in your team, that your technology is very disruptive, that people aren't already doing some of the things you're doing. Maybe you've got a key partnership. Your distribution partner already deals with 90% of the hospital systems in the United States. So those are all things that could be part of that unfair advantage that investors are looking for. And you have to talk about your competition. And part of that is investors want to know that your plan is grounded in reality. In, in many cases, investors invest in the same markets over and over again. So, or funding agencies tend to have topics that are in fairly narrow markets. So part of your credibility is knowing your market. And part of knowing your market is being able to name who your competitors are, because chances are the people that are judging you or grading you know who your competition is. And in your pitch, they're going to be sizing up where you fit against that competition in their mind. So make sure you talk about it. Um, it's really important when you talk about it is how you're differentiated. So um, are you going to be the low cost leader? So maybe you're differentiated because your manufacturing costs are so much lower. Um, do you have a open solution that the market may adopt more readily than, say, a proprietary piece of software or technology? So it's real important to be able to talk about how you're different. And graphically, everybody gets to pull out their MBA hat, even if they're not an MBA, is to do the 2x2 kind of chart, which very clearly and graphically says what it is that you're, where you think you exist, and you want to exist always in that upper right quadrant where you're the best on two of the axes that matter in the market. So think about your competition in terms of how you can compare, and think about ways you might be able um, to put these kinds of data together. It's real common. Another probably more relevant business example is if you ever look at the market studies that Gartner does, they always put people on these kind of axes, and it may be cost and flexibility, it may be cost and robustness, but those are the kinds of things that people try to look at, and this can be a really brief, concise, graphical way to get your point across. So we talked about traction, and what is traction? Traction is the uptake of your technology in the market, or the potential for uptake. So that's based on who have you talked to. You have to do customer discovery. You have to know that your technology solves a problem people actually want solved, that your technology fits within the workflows that the industry always does, that your technology um, fits at a price point that meets expectations based on incumbent solutions or competitors, or on the value you bring to the market. So it's real important. A lot of people talk about the concept of an MVP, or minimum viable product. Make sure you've done enough customer discovery that when you produce your MVP, it solves enough of the problem that your early adopters are willing to purchase it. And that validation can be people have bought your product, people intend to buy your product, you have a letter of commitment. You're doing paid pilot projects, so while you don't have a product, you're actually getting paid to do demonstrations of your technology. Having received a grant like an SBIR grant is some validation of your technology. So anytime someone's given you money or intends to give you money, those are things um, you can use to demonstrate traction in the market. And then the other thing is any milestones that you've achieved. You've produced your product, you've got your first sale, um, not likely, but you're already profitable. You're profitable within this product line. You've made a key hire as far as a technologist. You've signed a key distribution partner. Those are all milestones that demonstrate your ability to enter and gain market share. So we talk about marketing plans. There are myriads of ways where you can try and get your message out into the market. Um, and it's real important that you understand where your customers learn about things, where they find out about technologies they will eventually adopt. From other work I've done with medical technologies, very commonly it has to be in a refereed journal. There has to be a clinical trial. You have to have presented at um, a conference that has some degree of standing in your industry. So those are all real common things for a marketing plan. As you're going to publish, you're going to present, you're going to exhibit at an industry conference. If you've got a technology that's a direct-to-consumer technology, you may be doing Facebook ads, and you may be um, doing things with press releases, or it could be real important that your search engine optimization is really up to snuff. Um, but the things that an investor is going to look for is they want to see you set some goals that they can measure, and those are usually the volume of product you're going to sell, the price and cost, so they can figure out the profitability, and your conversion. What conversion is, if you get 10 prospective customers that reply to, they fill out a form on your website, how many of those will convert to sales? Is it 1 out of 10? Is it 2 out of 10? So understanding those metrics of your business give investors a better level of comfort that you know what you're doing. So your team. So predictably, your team should have some experience in the industry that you're working in. They may have a reputation. They may be considered subject matter experts. Um, but typically, you need a whole team. So having technology and no way to get it to market is not always helpful. So having a good technical team, having people in your team that have worked with venture capital or investors before is important if that's your exit strategy. Having people who are experienced in sales, marketing, or business development, who know how to actually get a product from interest in the market to actual revenue. Having those types of people is important. It's also important that you recognize where the gaps are in your organization. So if, you know, it can be very common to have a very technical founding team. And once they build the technology, they need to recognize that while they're kind of the evangelist and they're out there doing things, they probably need some type of business development resource um, to kind of get the right people into the pipeline and get the right conversations going so that the brilliance of those founder evangelists um, is leveraged against people who have money to spend. So think about what gaps you have and how you're going to fill them. So you may use consultants initially. You may have advisors. You may have an advisory board where an advisor knows how to connect you to the investment community, for example. Um, you want to talk about how you've either got candidates lined up or that you've got job descriptions and market level compensation figured out so that you can recruit as soon as you receive your funding. Um, so you want to make sure that it's clear that this is what we've got, we recognize what we need, and this is how we're going to fill that need. You need to do financials, and sometimes in the pitch deck, these end up in the backup slides, but having, again, graphs of revenue projections, sales forecast, um, usually you're going to have income, you're going to have costs, and then you're going to show where you turn profitable on a graph. That would be a very common look at what the financials are going to be. Um, and this has to be graphical, not tables and text. And the other thing to remember is that in general, cash is king. So even if you've got, you can look profitable, like you can have people who owe you money that looks like you're profitable. If you don't have the cash to make payroll or to buy new raw materials, you're out of business. So you're probably going to have some kind of statement about cash flow. And typically it's in terms of this investment gives us cash flow until we turn cash positive. So now that the business is generating the cash we need for continuing operations. So now we get to the kind of the end of it. This is the ask. How much money do you need and what are you going to use it for? Um, Very commonly what I've seen with investors is they underestimate the need. Something unforeseen comes up and they need more money. And if that's the case and you have to go back to your investors to get more money, but you haven't achieved the key milestones that they financed you on last time, it can be a very uncomfortable conversation. So my rule of thumb is ask for about 40% more than you think you're going to need, because you need a contingency fund. If you pivot or if the market's slow to adopt or a key hire costs more than you thought, these things all happen, and you need to have a plan. Um, so and build a couple budgets, kind of have a small, medium, and large, particularly if you're pitching to investors. You may get angel investors that'll invest at one level as opposed to a venture capital firm, which will invest usually at a much larger level. So figure out how you can make progress against any of those small, medium, and large plans. And always have that the plan in your pocket that says if someone gave you $1 million or $10 million, whatever the number you need is, what would you do with it? Because it's a good exercise to go through because it helps you prioritize how you're going to do things in your business and what milestones you're going to look for. So we talked a little bit about backup slides. So anything from that 12 slide outline that doesn't fit into the length of your pitch goes into backup slides. Other common ones, you may have your exit strategy may be in there. You may have a product demo, or you may have data from your product. You don't want this to be a technical presentation, but sometimes you get investors or an audience that is deep into technology and they want a little more technical detail. So have it available. Could be opinions from subject matter experts you talk to, could be a testimonial from an early adopter. It may be just a list of commitments you've got. You've got a channel partner signed up. You've got a manufacturing partner signed up. You're going to come up with a whole product solution by working with a value-added reseller. So these are all the kinds of things that you may put in your backup slide. So if during the Q&A someone says, so tell me a little bit more about how your technology works, you can bring up a visual while you talk over it. So um, don't get too hung up on the backup slides, but think about the things that you would like to talk about that didn't fit into that canned outline that you hope someone asks you, and make a slide for it. As I said, there's a lot of resources out there about pitch decks. Dave McClure is one that's, as I said, I drew a lot of information from this. There's one called Venture Hacks that's kind of voluminous, but if you're, someone who has to read things in depth, that's a good resource. Brad Feld, who runs Techstars, does some stuff. He has a AskTheVC.com blog. He's also occasionally does a free Venture Capital 101 webinar series. I think he just started one a couple weeks ago. So there could be opportunities there. And the other thing is just get onto SlideShare or other parts of the internet and find really good pitch decks. The one I highlight here, so Square is the company that had the little devices that go onto an iPad that let small merchants take credit cards, do credit card commerce. They have a really short, clean pitch deck. I think it's a good example. Some other ones people have looked at is like the Airbnb one. So if you find elements of a pitch deck you like and you're comfortable with and they fit your story, work them into the outline. As I said at the onset, it's really important that you are comfortable with what you're talking about, that you're passionate about what you're talking about. So pick the elements of this outline that help you tell your story best. So that's my my overview of developing a pitch deck. And the audience can be, it's probably not a bank, but if you're going for a loan, there's elements of this you still have to explain to a bank. But if you're in a pitch competition or you're talking to investors, or recently I know that with the Air Force, they have some SBIR special topics where rather than writing a large proposal, you do a 5-page proposal and a 15-slide pitch deck. So there are lots of places you might use a pitch deck or the concepts within a pitch deck. And I'm happy to answer any questions now about pitching in general.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ed. So we did have a couple questions that came through while you were speaking, and if anybody else has any additional questions, feel free to type them into the question box on the chat screen. I'll read these off to you, and as I mentioned, if there's any others, or if afterwards you guys come across any questions, my email address is at the bottom. We're happy to assist. Okay, so first question, what is the average time length of a pitch?
I would say the average is somewhere around 10 minutes. I've seen as short as 5. I've seen as long as 15. I do, like in a couple weeks, I'm going to be judging for the state of Colorado, and I think they give 8 minutes to pitch and 5 minutes for questions. So I would say 10 minutes is a rough estimate, and thinking you'll get through 12 slides in 10 minutes is ambitious. So you probably wouldn't use all 12 slides from the outline.
Okay, perfect. How much information about the team is enough information?
You really, the assumption is that, again, you're trying to get a meeting. So you don't need to give someone's complete vitae, but if someone has a PhD that's directly relevant to this, or if they've got experience with, having exited other startups successfully, those types of highlights are going to be important. But anybody on your team, unless they're a Nobel laureate, probably 2 to 3 bullets per person is the max.
Okay, wonderful. What if the pitch deck is being used to request a grant?
So elements of it are still important. You still need to clearly identify that there's a problem that needs to be solved, that your technology solves it, and that you have a value proposition. Even for grants, as you start to look at, like example is SBIR metrics, there has to be a return on investment. If someone's going to give you $1 million, they don't want to see you found a company that makes $500,000. They want to see you form a company that has a multiplier on whatever the investment is. So even for grants, I think it's clear that you have to, that same, minimal set of slides is still important. Problem, solution, market, product, traction, and team.
Great. How much confidential information should I provide without having an NDA in place?
That's a great question that has no easy answer. The first thing I'll tell you is almost any investor will not sign an NDA. And part of the reason is they look at a lot of deals and they don't want to be constrained or have to think back of, well, I can't talk to this person about this because I signed an NDA for that. So you're going to have to do some things that, like, you may not provide a lot of detail about your technology, technical depth. Probably the one thing that you don't want out there in the world that you're going to probably be forced to have out there in the world is your financials. But on the flip side, investors don't talk about other deals they're in because people will stop coming to them if they can't maintain some level of confidentiality. So always be aware of your audience and be aware of how far your information may be spread. If you have to leave a paper copy of your presentation, assume it could go anywhere and use the right amount of caution. And remember, you're pitching to get a conversation. So giving teasers that make people want to talk to you is fine if you're uncomfortable giving the full disclosure in a certain area that you think could allow someone else to compete with your business. So I know
Okay,
that wasn't a
wonderful.
real concise answer, but it's kind
Great.
of a
Oh, yeah,
case by case thing.
absolutely. Okay, looks like that is all the questions that we got. So as I mentioned, if you guys have any additional questions on this topic, feel free to reach out to us. My email address is at the bottom. Ed's email address was at the beginning of the slides. Also, following this webinar, you are all going to receive a link to the recording of this and a template to be used in preparing your pitch decks. Ed, thank you again for joining us today and for this great presentation. If anybody has any questions, reach out to us. We'll talk to you all soon, and we look forward to working with you all on your pitch decks. Take care.
All right, thanks. Good luck.